welcome. However you're listening tonight, let yourself settle in and drift towards sleep. Tonight, we're spending some time with the greatest hero the Greeks ever told stories about, a man named Heracles, son of Zeus himself, and the 12 impossible tasks it took to buy back his own life. In our previous episode, we saw two friends fused to stone chairs at the edge of the underworld, trapped there after a promise neither of them should have made. A stranger passing through on an errand of his own found them and pulled the first man free, the stone letting go all at once. He tried to free the second man the same way, but the ground itself shook so hard that the whole cavern threatened to come down, and he had to let go before it did. One friend walked free that day. The other is sitting there still. That stranger was Heracles. And by the time he reached the edge of the world, he'd already done 10 things no one else could have survived. A lion with skin no blade could cut. A Hydra that grew 2 heads for every one he took. A river he'd turned through a stable to clean out 30 years of filth in a single afternoon. The 11th task should have been simple by comparison. 3 golden apples from a tree at the edge of the world, guarded by a serpent and 3 singing sisters. There was only one problem. The apples belonged to the gods. No mortal hand was allowed to pick them, not even his. So when he found the garden, he didn't reach for the tree at all. He walked past it to the shape at the edge of everything, holding up the whole weight of the sky on 2 bent shoulders. Atlas. The Titan couldn't turn his head to see who'd arrived, not with that weight on him, but he knew the voice that spoke to him anyway. "I'll hold it," Heracles said. "Just long enough for you to pick 3 apples. You're the only one allowed to touch them." Atlas thought about it for a long moment, the longest he'd had to think about anything in longer than he could remember, and then he agreed. The 2 of them stood shoulder to shoulder while the weight passed from one to the other, and for the first time in an age, no one had bothered to count. Atlas straightened his back and walked toward his own garden, a free man. Heracles' knees buckled the moment the sky's full weight landed on him alone. He held it anyway. His arms shook. Sweat ran into his eyes, and he didn't have a hand free to wipe it away. Atlas came back with 3 apples cupped in his hands and stopped a few paces short. He was in no hurry to take the sky back. "I'll carry these to Eurystheus myself," he said. "It won't take me long. You can just stay like that until I'm back." Heracles understood exactly what was being offered to him and exactly what it would cost. He agreed at once. "Of course," he said. "Only, before you go, would you take this back for just a moment? The weight sits wrong on my shoulders. I need to fold my cloak into a pad or it'll wear straight through the bone." It was a small request, an ordinary one. Atlas set the apples down in the grass and took the sky back onto his own shoulders without thinking twice about it. Heracles bent down, picked up the apples, and started walking. He did not stop to fold a cloak. Behind him, Atlas realized what had happened at almost exactly the moment it became too late to undo it. He is still there. By every account that has ever been told about him, he always will be. This is the world we're spending the next while in. 12 tasks, each one built to be impossible, each one finished anyway. And every single time, something had to be left behind to pay for it. Before any of the labors, before the lion or the Hydra or the golden apples, there was a house. Heracles had a wife then, a woman named Megara, and 3 sons who still needed him to crouch down to their height when he spoke to them. To understand what happened to that house, it helps to go back even further to the night Heracles was born and the trick that had already been played on him before he ever drew a breath. Zeus had sworn an oath once that on a certain day, a descendant of the hero Perseus would be born who would go on to rule the great city of Mycenae. He meant Heracles. Heracles was the one meant to be born that day and inherit that throne. Hera heard the oath and saw her chance. She delayed Heracles' birth, holding it back by her own power, and at the very same time hurried along the birth of another descendant of Perseus, a weaker, more distant relation named Eurystheus, born early, born first, born just in time to claim the throne the oath had promised. By the time Heracles finally arrived, the crown was already gone, handed to a man who would spend the rest of his life afraid of him. That's the detail most retellings skip on the way to the lion and the labors, and it's worth keeping in mind for everything that follows. The king Heracles would come to serve wasn't simply some ruler assigned to him at random. He was the throne Heracles should have had, worn by someone else because of a trick played before either of them could speak. He had done nothing to earn what happened next either. That's worth sitting with too. Not a punishment for a crime, a punishment for who his father was. Hera had hated him since before he was born, simply because he was proof that Zeus had been unfaithful to her, and a hatred like that doesn't need a reason to grow, only time, and she had had plenty of it. She sent a madness down into that house. Not a fever, not a fit that passed in an hour. A complete, total unmaking of who he was for as long as it lasted, until the man standing in that house no longer recognized his own family and saw instead only enemies that needed to be dealt with. Even his own father, Amphitryon, was nearly lost that day, struck down and left for dead in the confusion before the madness finally released its grip. And some accounts say it was only the sudden arrival of the goddess Athena, hurling a stone hard enough to knock Heracles unconscious, that stopped the destruction from spreading any further than it already had. By the time it lifted, and it did lift all at once, the way a fever breaks, his sons were dead, and so was Megara. He came back to himself standing in the wreckage of his own home, and understood immediately, completely, and without anyone having to explain it to him, exactly what his hands had done. There's no version of this story where he ran from it. He didn't hide. He didn't ask anyone to look away from what he'd become. By the old belief the Greeks called miasma, a bloodstain of guilt that clung to a person after a killing, especially the killing of one's own family, no one was supposed to shelter him, speak to him, or even share a meal at the same table until that stain had been properly cleansed. A king named Thespius took him in anyway, for a time, performed the purification rites himself, and gave Heracles somewhere to stand while he decided what came next. What came next was Delphi. He walked there alone to the temple where the oracle spoke for Apollo, and asked the only question left worth asking: what does a man do after this? The Pythia's answer wasn't comfort. It was a sentence. He would go to the city of Tiryns and place himself under the service of Eurystheus, the very king who had already taken his birthright from him before he was even born, and he would do whatever that king asked of him for as long as it took. There's a particular kind of cruelty in that pairing, whether the gods intended it or not. The man who'd stolen his throne would now decide the shape of his punishment, too. 10 labors. That was the number the oracle gave him. 10 impossible tasks, chosen by a man who hated him and feared him in roughly equal measure, and only when they were finished would the stain of what happened in that house be considered paid for. it would become 12 before the end. Eurystheus found reasons to disqualify 2 of them along the way. Technicalities, fine print, and a bargain that was never really about fairness to begin with, and Heracles accepted the extension without arguing the point. This is the part most retellings skip past quickly on the way to the lion and the Hydra and everything after, and it's worth not skipping. The labors weren't an adventure he set out on. They were a debt owed to a man wearing a crown that should have been his. The old poets are fairly consistent on one detail. He never once complained about the size of it. There's a particular kind of grief that doesn't get smaller with time, only quieter, and Heracles carried his the way he carried everything else, by finding something enormous enough to put his hands around instead. Eurystheus was, by most accounts, a nervous king from the very start of this arrangement, uneasy about having a man of that strength bound to serve him, and afraid too, in some quiet corner of himself, that a man this capable might eventually decide the throne should have been his after all. It's said he had a great bronze jar buried in the palace grounds, specifically so he could climb inside and hide whenever Heracles returned from a task, and shout his instructions for the next one from somewhere safely underground. The first labor waiting for him was a lion in a valley called Nemea, whose hide no ordinary weapon could pierce. The first task waiting for him was a lion in a valley called Nemea, and it wasn't like other lions. Its hide couldn't be pierced. Not by bronze, not by iron, not by anything a blacksmith had ever forged, and the people living near that valley had learned this the hard way, watching arrows and spear points bounce off its skin as if they'd been thrown at solid rock. Some of the old poets said the lion hadn't been born on Earth at all, but had fallen from the moon itself, flung down by the goddess who kept it there, which was as good an explanation as any for a hide no forge on Earth could match. Heracles found the lion's cave first, and noticed it had 2 mouths, 2 ways in and out, cut through the hillside like a tunnel. He sealed one of them shut with boulders, so there'd only be one door left for the lion to use. Then he waited. When the lion came home that evening, Heracles fired an arrow at it anyway, more out of habit than hope, and watched the shaft glance off its ribs without leaving so much as a mark. So he set the bow down. He went into the cave after it, into the dark, into a space too narrow for the lion to use its full size against him, and got his arm around its neck. He held on. It fought him with everything it had, and everything it had was considerable, but Heracles didn't let go, not for a moment, not until the lion had stopped moving entirely. Afterward, he needed to skin it to bring proof back to Eurystheus, and found that the hide defeated every blade he owned, the same way it had defeated every weapon aimed at the lion while it was alive. In the end, he used one of the animal's own claws to cut through its own skin, since nothing else in the world could. He wore that hide for the rest of his life, the head still attached, worn like a hood over his own, and it became the first thing anyone ever recognized him by, from a distance, before they could see his face. Zeus, watching his son solve an impossible problem with his bare hands, was said to have placed the lion's image among the stars afterward, a constellation still visible tonight to anyone who knows where to look for it. Eurystheus was, if anything, more frightened by his return than he'd been by the task itself. He'd expected failure. He got a man wearing an invulnerable lion's skin, standing in his throne room, and by most accounts, that was the day he first started keeping that bronze jar close at hand. The second task took him to a swamp near a town called Lerna, where something older than the lion was waiting. The Hydra was a serpent, but not a simple one, its body sprouting many heads at once. and every old account agrees on the detail that made it truly dangerous. Cut one head off, and two grew back from the wound in its place. It shared its bloodline with the lion, as it turned out. Both were children of Typhon and Echidna, the same monstrous pair whose offspring kept surfacing throughout these stories, old chaos still finding new shapes to threaten the ordered world with. The swamp itself had a reputation long before the Hydra ever settled there. Locals believed one of its pools had no bottom at all, that it opened somewhere down into the underworld itself, and whether or not that was true, no one who lived nearby was eager to test it. Heracles didn't go into this one alone. He brought his nephew, a young man named Iolaus, to drive the chariot and help however he could, and it turned out that help would matter more than anyone expected going in. Every head Heracles severed, two more split out from the stump to replace it, exactly as the stories warned, and for a while it looked less like a fight he could win and more like a problem that only grew the more he worked at it. Hera hadn't forgotten him either. While he fought, she sent a single enormous crab up out of the swamp to pinch at his heel, one more obstacle added to a fight that already felt unwinnable, and Heracles simply crushed it underfoot without breaking his rhythm, the way a man swats an insect he barely notices. Hera placed that crab among the stars too, afterward, a small constellation for a small effort that hadn't changed anything. So Heracles changed the method instead. Each time he cut a head away, Iolaus pressed a burning torch against the open wound before anything new could grow there, sealing it shut with fire before the flesh had a chance to regenerate. One head resisted all of it. The center one, the immortal one, no blade could kill outright, so once every other head was gone and cauterized, Heracles severed that final one too and buried it under a massive boulder deep enough that it would never work its way back to the surface. Before he left the swamp, he did one more thing that would matter much later, long after this chapter of his life was finished. He dipped the tips of his arrows in the Hydra's blood, which carried a poison strong enough to kill almost anything it touched, and carried a full quiver of them away with him. Eurystheus, when he heard how the fight had actually gone, declared that this labor didn't count, on the grounds that Heracles had needed help to finish it. It was the first of 2 labors he'd strike from the official 10 this way, and Heracles accepted the ruling without argument, the same way he accepted everything else that was asked of him. The third beast was smaller than the other 2, but the path to it was not. A wild boar living on Mount Erymanthus, tearing through farmland and killing anyone who tried to stop it. On his way there, Heracles stopped at the cave of a centaur named Pholus, an old friend who welcomed him in and opened a jar of wine to share, a jar that, as it turned out, belonged to every centaur in the region collectively, not to Pholus alone. The smell of it reached the others fast. A crowd of centaurs arrived at the cave furious, believing their shared wine was being stolen out from under them, and the argument turned violent before either side had time to think better of it. Heracles fought them off with the same poisoned arrows he'd carried out of the Hydra's swamp, arrows that killed almost anything they touched, and in the chaos, one of them struck a centaur who had no part in the quarrel at all. Chiron, wisest of all the centaurs, teacher to heroes, immortal by birth, was hit in the leg by an arrow meant for someone else entirely. The poison couldn't kill him. It also couldn't be cured. He lived on after that in constant pain, unable to die and unable to heal, until many years later he found a way to give his immortality away to another being who badly needed it, and finally, at last, allowed himself to rest. Pholus himself died that same day too, by an accident with one of the same arrows pulled from a wound out of simple curiosity about what could do this much damage, and dropped it on his own foot. Heracles buried his friend there on the mountain and carried the weight of that day with him the same way he carried everything else, silently, and kept walking toward the boar he'd actually come there to find. This time he didn't need force. He needed patience. He chased the boar for days, driving it steadily upward through the mountain's terrain, away from the low ground where it had every advantage, and up into deep snow drifts near the summit, where its short legs sank with every step and its speed meant nothing anymore. Exhausted and half-buried, the boar stopped being dangerous at all. Heracles bound it, alive, and carried the whole struggling animal back to Tiryns on his own shoulders, exactly as the labor had demanded. Eurystheus, seeing that massive boar arrive still very much alive and very much furious, didn't wait to see what would happen next. He climbed into his bronze jar, the same one he'd had buried for exactly this kind of moment, and shouted his next instructions up through the lid, refusing to come out until Heracles had taken the animal away again. 3 beasts, 3 very different problems, and 3 very different solutions. Strength against the lion, cunning against the Hydra, patience against the boar. But it was the quiet cost along the way, a friend lost, a teacher poisoned beyond curing, that the stories remembered longest, even when Heracles himself kept moving forward without stopping to name it. Eurystheus had wanted him to fail. So far, he hadn't given the king a single chance to. The 4th labor sounded almost gentle by comparison, after a lion strangled barehanded and a Hydra burned down to nothing. Bring back a deer. But Eurystheus hadn't chosen an ordinary one. This deer had horns of solid gold, hooves of gleaming bronze, and belonged, body and breath, to the goddess Artemis herself. No mortal hand was meant to touch it, the same rule that had governed the golden apples, the same rule that seemed to follow every truly beautiful thing in these stories. And it was fast. Faster than any arrow ever loosed at it, which meant it couldn't be caught the way Heracles had caught everything else, by strength, by cornering it, by simply outlasting it in a fight. He tried anyway. He chased that deer on foot, across open plains, through forests, over rivers, for a full year without catching it once. The old poet Pindar, singing of it generations later, said the chase carried him past the cold-mouthed spring of the river Ister into the very land where the Hyperboreans lived, a people who dwelt beyond the reach of the north wind itself, untouched by sickness or old age, feasting endlessly beneath laurel trees, a place no other mortal had ever set eyes on before him. Even there, the deer outran him. Eventually, worn down by a year of running, Heracles changed his approach. He waited by a river the deer was known to cross, and when it finally came within reach, exhausted from the same year of running that had exhausted him, he loosed a single arrow, not to kill it, but to slow it, catching it cleanly between the bone and the tendon of one leg, just enough to bring it down without doing lasting harm. He lifted it onto his shoulders and started walking back toward Tiryns, certain for the first time in a year that this labor was finally finished. It wasn't. Artemis herself stepped into his path before he'd gone far, with her brother Apollo beside her, and neither one looked pleased to find a mortal carrying off something that belonged to her. Apollo spoke first, and what he said wasn't gentle. A warning that no one, mortal or otherwise, laid hands on something sacred to his sister and simply walked away from it. Heracles didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon either. He set the deer down gently in the grass between them, the way a man sets down something he never intended to keep, and told her the truth. Plainly, the way he seemed to tell everyone the truth once the moment actually arrived. He hadn't chosen this. He was bound by oracle to serve a king named Eurystheus, bound to complete whatever labor was set in front of him. And this was the labor, not his own idea, not a slight against her or anything she held sacred. He asked her forgiveness and promised the deer would be returned to her, unharmed the moment Eurystheus had seen it, and he meant every word of it, the same plain, uncomplicated honesty that had gotten him this far in every labor before this one. Artemis studied him for a long moment, Apollo watching just as closely beside her, waiting to see which way his sister would decide. Whatever she saw in Heracles' face was enough. She let him pass, not because his reasons excused him, but because she believed them, and because she'd heard enough of this man's story already to know he wasn't the kind who broke a promise once it was given. He kept his word. Eurystheus barely had time to look at the animal before Heracles was walking it back out of the palace grounds, north again, retracing a year's worth of steps to set it free exactly where he'd found it. And by every account, the wound in its leg healed clean, and it ran again exactly as fast as it always had. By some tellings, Eurystheus never even learned that the deer had already been returned before he saw it, and spent days afterward boasting to anyone who'd listen that he'd personally laid eyes on Artemis's sacred deer, a small, hollow victory for a man who'd done nothing but sit on a throne and wait. The fifth labor waited for him back near a marsh called Stymphalian, and this one had no interest in being chased at all. Birds lived there, not ordinary ones. A whole flock of them, sacred to the war god Ares, with beaks and claws made of solid bronze, and feathers sharp enough to be loosed like arrows, which was exactly what they did to anyone who came too close. Some of the old accounts say they hadn't always lived in that marsh at all, that they'd once ranged freely across the countryside until a pack of wolves drove them into the wetlands to escape, and finding the ground there too soft for any predator to follow, they simply never left. They had driven off farmers, killed livestock, and stripped entire fields bare, and the marsh itself made any direct approach nearly impossible. Water too shallow for a boat, ground too soft and waterlogged to walk across without sinking to the knee with every step. Heracles stood at the edge of that marsh for a long while, working the problem over. Strength wouldn't help him here. Neither would patience, not against a flock that could simply fly wherever the ground failed him. Athena found him there and gave him something no other labor had involved before this one, a gift. A pair of bronze castanets forged by Hephaestus himself in his own workshop, built for exactly one purpose. Heracles climbed a nearby hill overlooking the marsh and struck the castanets together. The sound was enormous, harsh enough that the birds scattered from the reeds all at once, startled into the air in a single panicked mass, wings beating so loudly the noise carried for miles. Once they were airborne, they were no longer protected by the marsh at all, and Heracles brought down as many as he could reach with his bow, the rest scattering outward, flying east, far past any land he could follow them into. Some accounts say a portion of that flock resurfaced years later on a small island in the Black Sea, encountered by an entirely different set of heroes on an entirely different voyage, still every bit as dangerous as the ones Heracles had faced, proof that not every threat in these stories gets fully resolved, only moved somewhere else for someone else to eventually deal with. 2 labors, and neither one solved the way the first 3 had been. The deer had asked for patience, stretched out longer than strength alone could manage, and a kind of honesty Eurystheus never once seemed to expect from anyone. The birds had asked for help, he couldn't have improvised on his own, a gift from a goddess who'd decided, for reasons of her own, that this particular labor was one worth lending a hand to. Eurystheus took the bird's bronze feathers as proof, turned them over in his hands like a man still not quite believing what he was looking at, set them aside without a word, and set the sixth labor in motion almost before Heracles had caught his breath. The sixth labor waiting for him didn't ask for strength or speed at all. It asked him to clean a barn. King Augean of Elis owned more cattle than any other man alive, thousands of them, a gift from his own father, the sun god Helios. Animals so numerous and so favored by the gods that not one of them had ever fallen sick a single day in 30 years. 30 years of cattle and 30 years of what cattle leave behind had piled up in those stables without a single day of cleaning. Filth built up so deep and so old that the smell alone was said to have driven entire villages from the surrounding countryside. Eurystheus set this labor expecting humiliation more than danger. A hero who'd strangled a lion and burned down a Hydra, reduced to shoveling manure like the lowest servant in any household. Heracles arrived at Elis and made Augean an offer before lifting a single tool. A wager plainly stated he would clean the entire stable in a single day, and in exchange he wanted a tenth of the cattle for himself. Augean laughed at him. 30 years of filth, cleared in one day by one man, seemed so far past impossible that he agreed without a second thought, certain he was promising away nothing at all. He didn't know who he was dealing with, or rather, he knew exactly who he was dealing with and still underestimated him, the same mistake nearly everyone in these stories eventually made. Heracles didn't pick up a shovel. He walked the length of the stable walls instead, studying the ground, the slope of the land, the two rivers running near the property, the Alpheus and the Peneus, and understood the problem the way he seemed to understand every problem that couldn't be solved by force alone. He broke open the stable walls at both ends and dug new channels from both rivers, diverting their current directly through the length of the building. The water did in hours what 30 years of neglect had built up, tearing through decades of filth and carrying every bit of it out the far end and down toward the sea, leaving the stable floor scoured clean down to bare stone by the time the sun went down. It should have been the easiest victory of all 12 labors. Instead, it became one of the two that never counted at all. Augean, once he saw the impossible actually finished, refused to pay what he'd promised, claiming Heracles had only done it under orders from Eurystheus in the first place, and had no right to ask for payment on top of a task he was already bound to complete. Heracles took the dispute to Augean, his own son, a young man named Phyleus, to judge fairly between them, and Phyleus, unable to lie about what he'd personally witnessed, testified that his father had indeed promised the cattle freely before any work began. Augean banished his own son from the kingdom for telling the truth, and refused Heracles the payment regardless of the verdict. Years later, once his labors were finally finished, Heracles would return to Elis with an army, remove Augean from his throne by force, and found the Olympic Games themselves on the very ground where that argument had taken place, though that's a story for much further down the road than we are tonight. For now, Eurystheus heard how the whole affair had unfolded, the wager, the broken promise, the dispute settled by a son against his own father, and declared that since Heracles had worked for payment rather than for him alone, this labor, too, would not be counted toward the 10. 2 labors struck from the list now, the Hydra and the stables both, and Eurystheus had found, almost by accident, a method that worked better than any monster he could send. Simply refused to be satisfied, no matter what was actually accomplished. The seventh labor took him across open water to the island of Crete, where King Minos ruled and where a very different kind of trouble was waiting. Years before, Minos had prayed to Poseidon for a sign that the gods favored his claim to the throne, and Poseidon had answered by sending a magnificent bull up out of the sea itself, white as sea foam, with the understanding that Minos would sacrifice it back to the god who'd sent it. Minos took one look at the animal and couldn't bring himself to do it. It was too fine a creature to slaughter, so he kept it for his own herds instead, and sacrificed a lesser bull in its place, hoping Poseidon wouldn't notice the difference. Poseidon noticed. His punishment for the deception was slow and specific. He drove the bull itself into a violent rage, tearing across the island and destroying everything in its path. And separately, he caused Minos' own wife, Pasiphae, to fall into an unnatural passion for the very animal her husband had refused to sacrifice. What came from that union was a creature with a bull's head and a man's body, a child later known as the Minotaur, and that particular thread of the story runs on for years past tonight, into a labyrinth and a hero named Theseus. But that's not the thread we're following right now. Our thread is simpler. Eurystheus wanted the rampaging bull itself, captured alive and brought back to Tiryns, and Minos, for his part, was only too glad to let Heracles take the animal off his island entirely. Heracles found the bull tearing through farmland, approached it directly without any trick or gift from a god this time, and simply wrestled it to the ground by main strength, holding on through every attempt it made to throw him off until the fight had gone out of it entirely. He carried it, swimming, across the open sea back to the mainland, the bull too exhausted by then to do anything but follow where it was led, and delivered it to Eurystheus exactly as asked. Eurystheus, faced with an enormous, still dangerous bull standing in his own courtyard, did what he always did when Heracles' success became a problem of its own. He set the animal free rather than keep it anywhere near himself. The bull wandered loose across the countryside for years afterward, eventually settling near a town called Marathon, terrorizing the region there the same way it once had on Crete, until a very different hero, on a very different day, would be the one to finally deal with it for good. 2 labors this time too, but where the deer and the birds had asked for patience and help, these had asked for something closer to cleverness, a river redirected instead of fought, a debt owed and refused, a bull wrestled down by strength alone once every other option had already been tried by someone else first. Eurystheus was running out of ordinary monsters to send him. What came next would take him further from home than any labor yet. The 8th labor took him to Thrace, to the court of a king named Diomedes, a son of Ares who kept 4 horses unlike any others in the world. They were beautiful animals, by every account, strong-necked and wild-eyed the way all fine horses are, but Diomedes had trained them on something no ordinary stable would ever feed a horse: human flesh. Any stranger unlucky enough to wash up on that stretch of coast, any guest foolish enough to accept the king's hospitality, was liable to end up thrown into those stalls instead of a proper bed, and the mares had grown accustomed to it, straining at their iron chains whenever they caught the scent of a new arrival, lips pulled back, teeth bared like animals that had long ago stopped being afraid of anything. Eurystheus wanted them brought back alive, the same as he'd wanted the boar and the bull before them, and Heracles set out for Thrace with a small group of companions, among them a young man he was especially fond of, named Abderus. Getting into the stables wasn't the hard part. Heracles overpowered the guards fast, one after another, before any of them could raise a real alarm, and drove the mares out toward the sea before Diomedes even knew his prized animals were gone. Diomedes gave chase with what soldiers he could gather on short notice, armor thrown on half-fastened, spears grabbed straight off the rack, and Heracles, needing both hands free to fight them off, left the mares in Abderus' care for what he expected to be only a few minutes. It was long enough. Heracles fought the soldiers in close, ugly work, blade against blade in the dark, no room to swing freely, driving them back one and two at a time until the rest lost the stomach for it and broke off the chase entirely. By the time he'd beaten them back and turned toward the shore, the mares had already turned on the one person left unguarded near them, and Abderus was gone. There's no version of this story where Heracles handled that news quietly. He drove the mares back toward the palace himself, hauling them by their chains through streets still dark with early morning, and when he reached Diomedes, he didn't hesitate. He threw the king down in front of his own animals, the same stalls, the same chains, the same hungry mares, still wild from the taste of blood only hours old, and fed him to them, the exact fate Diomedes had fed to countless strangers before him, a punishment that fit the crime with an exactness the old poets clearly appreciated, since nearly every surviving account includes it. Something changed in the mares after that. Whether it was the taste of their own master's blood, or simply that the one man who'd trained their hunger was gone, they calmed enough for Heracles to lead them the rest of the way back to Tiryns without further trouble. Before he left Thrace, though, he buried his friend properly and founded a city on that same stretch of coast in his memory, naming it Abdera, so that something of the boy would remain standing long after the grief itself had gone quiet. Eurystheus, faced once again with dangerous animals he had no idea what to do with, set these mares free too, the same as the Cretan bull before them, and by most accounts they wandered until they were eventually killed by wild beasts in the mountains, their unnatural hunger finally answered by something hungrier still. The ninth labor was different from everyone before it, not because the task itself was harder, but because of who was asking Heracles to bring it back. Eurystheus had a daughter, a girl named Admete, and Admete had heard stories of the Amazons, a nation of warrior women living far to the east near the Black Sea, ruled by a queen named Hippolyta, who wore a war belt gifted to her by Ares himself, a mark of her authority over her people. Admete wanted that belt, the way a girl who has everything still sometimes wants the one thing she doesn't have, and Eurystheus, unable or unwilling to refuse her, made it the next labor. Heracles sailed east with a crew of companions, expecting, if the old stories about the Amazons were even half true, that this would end in a war he'd have to fight his way through. It didn't at first. Hippolyta received him with real hospitality, curious about a hero whose reputation had reached even her shores, and when Heracles explained plainly why he'd come, exactly the way he'd explained himself to Artemis over her sacred deer, Hippolyta considered the request fairly and agreed to simply give him the belt. No trick, no fight. Just one queen deciding a hero's honesty deserved a straightforward answer. It should have ended there. Hera, who had never once stopped looking for a way to see this particular labor fail, disguised herself as one of the Amazon warriors and moved through the camp spreading a rumor that the strangers had actually come to kidnap their queen, that the peaceful exchange happening on the beach was a trick to lower everyone's guard. The Amazons, believing their queen was in real danger, armed themselves fast, horses saddled in a hurry, bows strung on the run, and rode down toward the shore in force. Heracles, seeing armed warriors charging his ships with no warning and no explanation, assumed the worst, assumed Hippolyta herself had turned on him despite everything that had just been agreed, and gave the order to meet the charge rather than be run down by it. What followed was chaos on the sand, riders and footmen tangled together in the dark, shouted warnings lost under the sound of hooves and steel, neither side able to hear anything true over their own certainty that they were the ones under attack. In the middle of it, in a fight neither side had actually wanted moments before it began, Hippolyta was killed. He took the belt from her body, not as a trophy taken by force, but as the very thing she had already freely given him, before a lie neither of them had spoken made that gift look like a lie itself. Some of the older poets tell it differently, with no battle at all, only the honest exchange, and it's worth knowing both versions exist, since even the ancient sources couldn't fully agree on how that day actually ended. What every version agrees on is this. He brought the belt back to Tiryns, and Admete finally had the thing she'd wanted, a war belt worn now by a girl who would never once have to earn it the way its first owner had. 2 labors, and in both of them, the actual danger hadn't come from the creature or the queen at all, but from misunderstanding, hunger, and a goddess still working every angle she could find to turn success into grief. Eurystheus was 2 labors from finished with the original 10, though by now everyone involved understood the number would keep moving further away the closer it got. The 10th labor sent him further from home than any before it, past every border he'd already crossed, to the very edge of the known world. Eurystheus wanted the red cattle belonging to a giant named Geryon, kept on an island called Erythea, so far to the west that most people who spoke of it weren't entirely sure it was a real place at all, or simply a way of describing everything past the point where maps stopped being useful. Geryon himself was unlike anything Heracles had faced before. 3 bodies joined together at the waist, 3 sets of arms, 3 sets of legs, so that he moved less like a single giant and more like 3 men who happened to share the same lower half. He was, by every account, a grandson of Medusa, born from the blood that had spilled from her severed neck, a bloodline running straight back to one of the strangest deaths in any of these stories. To reach him at all, Heracles first had to cross the whole width of the world as the Greeks understood it, through Libya, through the wild country of the Iberians further north, and at the strait where the sea narrows before opening into the endless ocean beyond. He raised 2 great pillars, one on each shore, to mark the edge of everything he knew, pillars that still carry his name today. Past that point, there was only water, and no ship in the world was built to cross it. The heat along that stretch of coast was brutal enough that Heracles, soaked through with sweat, his lips cracked, his shadow the only shade for miles in any direction, finally drew his bow on the sun itself, threatening to shoot Helios out of the sky for baking him alive with nowhere left to hide from it. Helios, more amused than offended by the sheer audacity of it, didn't strike him down. He offered him something instead. Every night, the sun god sailed home across the ocean in a great golden cup, wide enough to hold a chariot and its horses, the vessel he used to travel from where he set in the west back to where he rose again each morning in the east. He lent that cup to Heracles, and Heracles crossed the open water in it, the horizon nothing but black water and stars in every direction, sailing through a night that belonged by rights to no mortal traveler at all. Erythea itself was a quiet place, green pasture running down to rocky shoreline, and the red cattle grazed there under 2 guardians. A herdsman named Eurytion, and beside him, a 2-headed hound called Orthrus, kin to the very Hydra Heracles had already burned down to nothing, both children of the same monstrous parents, Typhon and Echidna, whose bloodline seemed to touch nearly every danger in these stories somehow. Orthrus caught his scent first, both heads snapping toward him at once, hackles raised along a spine built wide enough for 2 skulls, and charged low across the grass without a single sound of warning. Heracles didn't wait for it to close the distance. He met it mid-stride, swinging his club in a single flat arc, and both heads went still before the animal's body had even finished its leap, the hound dead in the air before it landed. Eurytion came next, spear already leveled, shouting something Heracles never got the chance to answer, and it ended the same way, one motion, no more ceremony than the dog had gotten. The sound of it, metal and impact carrying flat across open pasture, reached Geryon on the far side of the island, and the giant came for him personally. 3 shields raised in a wall of overlapping bronze, 3 spears leveled at 3 different heights, bearing down on a single mortal man the way an avalanche bears down on whatever happens to be standing in the valley below it. Heracles didn't meet that charge head-on. He circled instead, boots skidding on wet grass, putting Geryon's own bulk between himself and 2 of the 3 spear points at once, so that only one of the giant's 3 fronts could actually face him at any given moment. He drew and loosed an arrow already dipped in the same Hydra's blood that had claimed one accidental victim earlier on this very journey. It found its mark below the collarbone of the nearest body, punching clean through muscle and bone, and didn't stop there. The force and the angle carrying it straight on into the body joined beside it. The wound that had killed the Hydra a decade of stories ago now did the same work here. Poison spreading fast through a bloodstream all 3 bodies shared, and Geryon went down all at once, 3 sets of knees buckling in the same instant, 3 shields clattering to the grass together. The old poet Stesichorus, singing of this moment generations later, didn't treat it as simple triumph. His version lingers on the giant's fall the way a person lingers on the death of something they never wanted dead in the first place. A single flower, its stem cut, its head bending slowly toward the earth, petals scattering before it even finished falling. Not every monster in these stories is written as something worth celebrating the death of. Heracles gathered the cattle and began the long drive home, and this labor, unlike almost any before it, wasn't finished the moment the fighting stopped. The journey back took him through Iberia, up through the wild country later known as Gaul, and down the length of Italy, and at nearly every stop along that route, something tried to take the herd from him. In Italy, a fire-breathing giant named Cacus stole several of the cattle while Heracles slept, dragging them backward into his cave by their tails, hoofprints pressed into the dirt, pointing the wrong direction entirely. A clever trick that worked right up until one of the stolen cattle called out from somewhere deep underground, and was answered by the rest of the herd, still with Heracles, giving the theft away by nothing more than the ordinary sound of an animal recognizing its own kind. Heracles tore the boulder, sealing the cave entrance clean off its footing, and Cacus met him in the dark and the smoke of his own lair, breath like a forge fire, claws raking for anything within reach. But the fight barely counted as one, ending in the same short, decisive violence as everything else on this labor. In Sicily, a king named Eryx challenged him to a wrestling match, wagering his entire kingdom against a single bull from the herd, certain enough in his own strength to risk everything on it. They grappled for longer than either fight before it, Eryx driving him back once, twice, a king who'd clearly won matches like this before against lesser men, before Heracles found his footing, got an arm locked under him, and threw him down hard enough that the match ended in the same motion it turned. He lost badly and paid the wager with his life rather than his throne. Even Hera hadn't given up. Somewhere in Thrace, she sent a maddening gadfly down onto the herd, biting and stinging until the cattle bolted in every direction across the countryside, hooves tearing up whole fields in their panic, and Heracles spent weeks afterward simply gathering them back together, one by one, patience standing in for strength yet again, the same way it had against the Boar years before. When he finally reached Tiryns, herd intact, the labor technically finished, Eurystheus didn't keep the cattle for himself. He sacrificed the entire herd to Hera instead, a gesture that managed to be an insult to Heracles and an offering to his enemy in the exact same motion, and by now, that particular kind of pettiness had stopped being surprising to anyone paying attention. 10 labors were finished. 2 had already been struck from the count. The oracle's original number was behind him, and the debt, by any honest reckoning, should have been paid in full. It wasn't. The 11th labor was the one that would carry him furthest from anything resembling an ordinary fight. 3 golden apples growing on a tree at the edge of the world, in a garden that belonged to Hera herself, a wedding gift from the earth goddess Gaia when Zeus first married her. No mortal was meant to go anywhere near it, and Heracles didn't even know, starting out, exactly where it was. The road there ran through Libya first, and in Libya waited a giant named Antaeus, a son of the earth itself who wrestled every traveler who crossed his territory, and had never once lost, because touching the ground was where his strength came from, and the ground was something he never had to leave. Heracles fought him the way anyone would expect a wrestling match to go, grappling for footing on packed sand, Antaeus throwing him down hard enough to leave the wind knocked clean out of him, and rising up stronger every single time he touched the earth again. It took a few rounds of exactly that, being thrown, watching the giant rise up, renewed instead of weakened, before Heracles understood what he was actually fighting. The next time Antaeus came at him, Heracles didn't let the fight go back down to the ground at all. He got both arms locked around the giant's waist, lifted him clean off his feet, and held him there, straining, off the earth entirely, until the strength that had never once failed him simply had nowhere left to draw from. Antaeus went still in his arms, and Heracles set the body down, the only opponent on this whole journey beaten not by force alone, but by understanding exactly where that force came from. Egypt came next, and a different kind of danger. A king named Busiris, who'd been told by an oracle years earlier that sacrificing a stranger to Zeus every year would end a famine that had gripped his kingdom. It had worked, or seemed to, and Busiris had kept doing it every year since, capturing travelers who passed through his lands and offering them up on a stone altar built for exactly that purpose. Heracles was seized the moment he arrived, bound and led toward that same altar, and let it happen right up until the ropes were actually around him and the priest's knife was raised. Then he broke the bindings outright, tearing free with a single motion, and killed Busiris on his own altar, along with the priest and the king's son who'd helped hold him down, ending 9 years of that particular sacrifice in the space of a few seconds. Further on, in the mountains past the edge of Egypt, he found something he hadn't expected to find at all. A figure chained to bare rock, wrists and ankles bound in iron driven straight into the stone itself, and an eagle circling above him, descending toward his side the way it apparently did every single day. This was Prometheus, the Titan who'd stolen fire from the gods and given it to humanity, generations before any of tonight's stories began, and Zeus's punishment for it had been exact and endless. Every day, the eagle tore open his side and fed on his liver. Every night, because he was immortal, the wound closed and the organ grew back whole. And every morning, the eagle returned to do it again, a punishment with no end built into it anywhere. Heracles didn't need to be asked. He drew his bow the moment the eagle came into range, and brought it down before it reached the Titan's side even once that day, then broke the iron chains the same way he'd torn through Busiris's ropes, hand over hand, until the metal simply gave. Prometheus was free for the first time since the punishment began, and grateful in a way that went beyond simple thanks. He knew exactly where the garden was and exactly what waited there, and he gave Heracles the one piece of advice that would end up mattering more than anything else on this labor. Don't reach for the apples yourself. Send Atlas. Atlas alone was permitted to touch them, Prometheus explained, his own brother, bound to hold up the sky at the edge of the world as punishment for choosing the losing side in the war against the gods, and no mortal hand, however strong, would ever be allowed to pick them directly. Heracles carried that advice the rest of the way to the garden, past every last landmark, until the ground gave out into nothing and the sky itself seemed to start right at the edge of the grass. The tree was smaller than he'd expected, no taller than a man could reach without climbing, but every branch on it hung heavy with apples that glowed instead of simply catching the light, gold enough to look wet. Coiled around the trunk 7 times over was the serpent ladon, thick enough that the bark had grown around its scales in places, an eye open that hadn't blinked in longer than anyone alive could measure. Nearby, 3 sisters, the Hesperides, sang low and unhurried beneath the branches, the same 6 notes over and over, the way a song sounds once it's stopped being a song and simply become the sound a place makes. And past all of it, at the very edge of the world, Atlas stood with his shoulders bent under the whole weight of the sky, exactly where Prometheus had said his own brother would be. Heracles didn't reach for the tree. He walked past it, straight to Atlas, and made his offer plainly, the same honest way he'd made every offer on this entire journey. He would hold the sky, just long enough for Atlas to walk to his own garden and pick 3 apples with the only hands in the world actually allowed to touch them. Atlas considered it for a long moment, the longest he'd had to think about anything in an age he couldn't measure, and agreed. The weight passed between them all at once, and Heracles' knees buckled the instant it landed fully on him alone, arms shaking, sweat running into his eyes with no free hand to wipe it away, while Atlas straightened a back that hadn't stood fully upright in longer than anyone could count, and walked toward his own tree, a free man for the first time in that same age. He came back with 3 apples cupped in his hands, and didn't hand them over. He'd had time to think on that short walk and back, and what he'd thought about was staying free. He offered to carry the apples to Eurystheus himself. It wouldn't take long, he said, and Heracles could simply stay exactly like this until he returned. Heracles understood exactly what was being offered to him and exactly what it would cost, and agreed at once without any argument at all. Only, he said, before Atlas walked off, would he take the sky back for just a moment. The weight sat wrong across his shoulders, and he needed to fold his cloak into a proper pad, or it would wear straight through the bone. It was a small request, an ordinary one. Atlas set the 3 apples down in the grass and took the sky back onto his own shoulders without thinking twice about it. Heracles bent down, picked up the apples, and started walking. There was no cloak. There never had been. Behind him, Atlas understood what had happened at almost exactly the moment it became too late to undo it, and by every account that has ever been told about him, he is standing there, still. 11 labors now. Only one left, and it would take him somewhere no other labor had asked him to go, down instead of out. The 12th labor was the one Eurystheus had saved for last on purpose, the one built to be impossible rather than merely difficult. Go down into the underworld itself and bring back its guardian, Cerberus. 3 heads on one massive body, a serpent for a tail that struck at anything within reach on its own, a mane made of writhing snakes along the back of each neck, and a temperament that made every other beast on this list look almost gentle by comparison. No living man was meant to walk down into that realm and walk back out again, and Eurystheus, setting this labor, seemed fairly confident he wouldn't have to worry about seeing Heracles again at all. Heracles didn't go down unprepared. He traveled first to Eleusis, near Athens, to be initiated into rites so sacred that those who underwent them were sworn never to describe exactly what happened during them, a secrecy that is held, remarkably, for thousands of years since. What's known is this much. The rites promised something no other ritual in the Greek world claimed to offer, a way of facing death, even briefly, and coming back changed by having seen it, so that whatever waited below would no longer be entirely unknown territory. Only once he'd undergone that could he go down with any real chance of returning. The entrance itself was said to be real and findable, a cave at Cape Taenarum at the very southern tip of Greece, where the land simply stopped and a crack in the rock led down into a dark that didn't behave like ordinary darkness, a place sailors avoided even naming out loud if they could help it. Hermes, guide of souls, the only god whose job it was to walk this exact road for a living, led the way through that same crack in the rock, and Athena walked beside him too, the same way gods had quietly stood behind nearly every labor before this one, usually in ways Eurystheus never heard about. The way down was long, the air growing colder and thinner with every step, the last daylight behind them fading to a memory rather than a presence, until the three of them were moving more by memory of which way was forward than by anything they could actually see. Near the gate at the bottom of that descent, Heracles came across two men he recognized, fused into stone seats they'd sat down in years earlier and never managed to rise from again. Theseus, and beside him his friend Pirithous, both of them trapped by the same chairs of forgetting that had already taken their names, and most of who they'd been before either could stand back up. Heracles took hold of Theseus first, and pulled, and the stone let go all at once, so suddenly that Theseus staggered forward like a man waking from an unusually deep sleep. He turned to Pirithous next, and pulled the same way, and the ground itself shook hard enough that dust fell from somewhere far above them, enough that for a moment it seemed the whole cavern might come down with it. Heracles let go before that could happen. Pirithous did not come free. He is still sitting there, and by every account that has ever been told about him, he always will be. Not far past that gate, a herdsman named Menetes stood watching over Hades' own dark cattle, and he'd heard, somehow, exactly who was walking through his master's realm uninvited. He didn't step aside. He challenged Heracles outright, the same instinct that had put Antaeus and Eryx and half the strong men on this whole journey into a fight they didn't need to start, certain his own strength was equal to whatever reputation had preceded this stranger. It wasn't. Heracles grappled him down fast, ribs cracking audibly under the pressure of the hold, and would have broken him further still if a voice hadn't stopped him first. Persephone herself asked him to let the herdsman go, and Heracles did immediately, setting Menetes down rather than finishing what his own strength had already started, one of the only mercies shown to anyone on this entire 12-year debt, granted at a queen's word alone. Further in, the dark opened into a hall too large for its edges to ever come into full view, and at the center of it, waiting, sat Hades himself with Persephone beside him. Heracles asked for exactly what he'd come for, plainly the same honest way he'd asked everything of everyone on this entire 12-year debt. Hades listened and considered and agreed on one condition. Heracles could take the hound, but only if he could subdue it using nothing but his own 2 hands. No club, no sword, no arrows dipped in anything that had ever killed a Hydra or a Titan. Heracles agreed and went to find him. Cerberus was waiting near the gates he guarded, 3 heads turning toward him almost independently of each other, each one snarling on its own rhythm, teeth bared, the snake mane along each neck hissing on its own separate rhythm, the serpent tail already lashing at the ground behind him. Heracles set down everything he carried, his club, his bow, the quiver of arrows that had already ended nearly every fight on this entire journey, and approached with empty hands. The hound came at him from all 3 heads at once, jaws snapping in a blur too fast to fully track, and Heracles took the impact head-on, wrapping both arms around the thick muscle of its neck the same way he'd once wrestled a lion into stillness in a cave with no room to swing a weapon. The weight of it drove him back a step, then another, claws raking at his sides, one head twisting hard enough to nearly break his grip, but he held on, arms locked, boots dug into the ground the way they dug in against Antaeus in the sand of Libya. The serpent tail struck at him again and again while he held on, fangs grazing skin that didn't break, poison finding nothing soft enough to sink into. And slowly, one great shuddering breath at a time, the fight went out of all 3 heads together, the snarling easing first, then the thrashing, until the enormous body simply went still in his arms. He didn't kill it. That had never been the task. He simply held it, subdued, until it stopped fighting him and let itself be led. He carried Cerberus all the way back up to the surface, up through the same long dock he'd descended through, and into daylight the hound had never once seen in its entire existence. 3 heads flinching together at a brightness nothing below had ever prepared them for. Eurystheus, who had spent 11 labors climbing into a bronze jar every time Heracles returned with proof of success, did not wait to see this one up close either. One look at the 3-headed hound of the underworld standing in his own courtyard, and he was back in that jar before Heracles had even finished crossing the gate, shouting through the lid that the labor was done. It was proven, it counted. Please take the animal back to where it came from immediately. Heracles did exactly that. He carried Cerberus back down the same way he'd carried it up and returned it to Hades exactly as promised, the one condition kept in full. 12 labors. 10 that the oracle had originally demanded. 2 more added along the way through technicalities that were never really about fairness to begin with, and every single one of them finished in the end by a man who had never once complained about the size of the debt he was paying. The stain from that house all those years ago was considered clean at last. The labors were finished, the debt paid in full, and for the first time since a madness had taken everything from him, Heracles was free to simply live. He found a wife again, eventually, a woman named Deianira, Princess of Calydon, and no ordinary courtship had won her. Before Heracles ever arrived, she'd already been claimed by another suitor, a river god named Achelous, who could take any shape he wanted and had taken several trying to win her. A serpent first, coiling low across the ground, tongue tasting the air, and then a great bull, hooves tearing up the earth, horns lowered, daring anyone to take her from him by force. Heracles fought him in that last shape, grappling those horns in both hands, muscle straining against muscle, the bull driving forward again and again trying to pin him, until Heracles twisted the whole weight of the animal sideways and forced its head down into the dirt. Achelous yielded there, pinned, but not before Heracles had already snapped one horn clean off in the struggle, a trophy the river god would beg to have returned for years afterward, offering treasures in exchange that Heracles never once accepted. Deianira became his wife, and for a while, an ordinary while, they simply lived and had a son together, a boy named Hylas, who grew up watching a father most sons only ever heard about in stories told by other people. Then came a river that needed crossing, swollen and fast enough that Deianira couldn't manage it on her own, and a centaur named Nessus was working there as a ferryman, carrying travelers across on his own back for a fee. Heracles crossed first under his own strength and trusted Nessus to carry his wife across behind him. Partway through that crossing, Nessus tried to take her, the centaur's grip closing where it shouldn't have, the current suddenly not the only danger in that water. Deianira screamed for help, and Heracles heard her from the far bank and put an arrow through the centaur's chest before Nessus had made it more than a few strides toward the shore, the same poisoned arrows that had already ended a giant, a hound, and a king who fed guests to his horses. Nessus knew, dying, exactly what that poison meant. There was no surviving it, and no time left to waste on anything but one final act of spite. He told Deianira, in what breath he had left, to collect the blood pooling from his wound and keep it safe. If Heracles' love for her ever seemed to fade, he told her, this same blood, worked into a garment he wore, would bring his devotion back stronger than ever. It was a lie. The blood was poisoned by the same arrow that had just killed him, and Nessus, with his last words on earth, handed a grieving, frightened wife exactly the weapon he needed her to carry away from that riverbank without knowing what it actually was. Years passed before that lie ever mattered. Heracles took an interest eventually in a younger woman named Iole, and word of it reached Deianira the way word of these things always seems to, second-hand, incomplete, and enough on its own to frighten a wife who'd already loved one man through everything else this story has already covered. She remembered the blood. She remembered what Nessus had promised it could do. She worked it into a fine robe and sent it to Heracles by way of a messenger named Lycus, meaning only to win back a devotion she believed had genuinely started to wander. Heracles put the robe on without a second thought. The poison woke the moment his own body's warmth reached it, a heat spreading beneath the fabric that felt nothing like ordinary fire, crawling up from his shoulders into his chest, deeper with every passing breath. And when he tried to tear the robe away, it came with pieces of his own skin fused to it, the cloth and the man no longer separable from one another. The pain was beyond anything the labors had ever asked him to endure, worse than the lion's grip, worse than the Hydra's poison working through someone else's wound instead of his own hands tearing at his own chest, trying to reach whatever was burning underneath, and in the first blind agony of it, he threw Lycus from a cliff into the sea, a messenger who'd carried a gift he had no idea was fatal, paying for a crime that was never really his. Deianira understood, once the truth reached her, exactly what she'd done, and took her own life rather than live with having killed the man she'd only ever tried to keep. Heracles sent for his son before the end. Hylas came to him on that mountainside and found a father he barely recognized, skin fused to cloth, strength finally failing after a lifetime where it never once had. Heracles asked one last thing of him, not for himself, but for Iole, the same woman whose name had started all of this without any real fault of her own. Marry her, he told his son. Don't let her be left with nothing and nowhere once I'm gone. Hylas agreed, though the request clearly cost him something to accept, and kept that promise faithfully in the years that followed, the last labor his father ever asked of anyone. Heracles knew there was no curing this. He asked to be carried to the top of Mount Ita, and there, with his own hands, built a great pyre, logs stacked high enough to burn a body completely, the way a man builds his own ending when he's decided the ending has already arrived. He climbed onto it himself, still burning from the inside, and asked those gathered to light it. No one could bring themselves to do it, until a young archer named Philoctetes finally agreed, and Heracles gave him his bow and those same poisoned arrows in exchange, weapons that would go on to matter greatly in a war fought generations later at a city called Troy. The fire took quickly. What happened next depends on which poet you trust, but every version agrees on the shape of it. Zeus looked down at his son burning on that mountain, and rather than let death be the last word on a life that had already paid every debt anyone could reasonably demand of it, he drew what was mortal in Heracles up out of the flame and carried what remained of him to Olympus. There, among the gods his own father had always belonged to, Hera herself finally set her anger aside, and Heracles married Hebe, goddess of youth, and became, at the very end of a life built almost entirely from suffering he never once complained about, something more than a mortal man had any right to become. This is where we leave him. Not on the mountain and not in the fire, but somewhere past both of them, at rest, finally, for the first time since a madness took everything from him and asked him to spend the rest of his life earning it back. 12 labors, and a life on either side of them that looked almost nothing alike. Before them, a man capable of things no one else could survive, and after them, something closer to a god. But it's worth sitting for a while with everything that happened in between, because that's where the actual man lived, not in the strength and not in the ending, but in the years spent simply doing what was in front of him. He never once got to choose the terms. Not the madness that took his family, not the debt the oracle handed him afterward, not the king who feared him enough to disqualify 2 honest labors out of pure spite. What he did choose every single time was how to meet whatever arrived next. Sometimes that meant strength, a lion held until it stopped moving, a river bent through stone walls in a single afternoon. Sometimes it meant patience, a year spent chasing a deer he refused to kill, weeks spent gathering scattered cattle back together one by one. And sometimes it meant something quieter than either, simple honesty offered to a goddess furious enough to kill him, to a queen who had no reason to trust a stranger, and both times that honesty was what actually carried him through. Not everyone made it to the end of this story with him. Abderus didn't. Neither did Pholus or the centaur Chiron, caught by an arrow that was never meant for him at all, carrying a wound that couldn't heal for years afterward until he finally found a way to set it down. Grief like that doesn't get resolved simply because a labor gets finished. It just gets carried, the way Heracles carried nearly everything else, quietly and without asking anyone to look away from it. In our previous episode, we saw 2 friends fused to stone chairs at the edge of the underworld, one of them freed by a stranger passing through on an errand of his own. That stranger was Heracles, on his way to fetch a 3-headed hound, the very last of these 12 labors, though neither of the men he found that day had any way of knowing that at the time. It's a small thing, one story quietly touching another, but these old tellings were never really separate to begin with. They all took place in the same dark, underneath the same sky, among people who kept crossing each other's paths without ever fully knowing it. There's a version of this story where the 12 labors are the whole point, a checklist of monsters, each one bigger and stranger than the last. But the old poets who told it best always lingered somewhere else, On Atlas, walking free for the first time in an age he couldn't measure, on a Titan chained to bare rock, fed on by the same bird every single day, until someone finally stopped to notice him, on a river god still asking, years later, for a horn he was never going to get back. Even the ending wasn't really about the fire. It was about a man who'd spent his whole life being asked to endure things no one should have to, finally being allowed to stop. Somewhere above all of it, past the labors and the poison and the mountain, he is resting now, among gods who once feared what he was capable of, married to a goddess whose name simply means youth, as if the years of struggle finally bought him back the one thing they'd taken from him first. Whatever debt you're carrying tonight, whatever feels too large to set down, it's worth remembering that even a story built entirely around impossible tasks ends, eventually, in rest. Not because the tasks stop being hard, because someone kept meeting them one at a time for as long as it took. Sleep well.
you.